Chapter 11. "A giant?" asked Sapphire. "Yes," said Helen. "No, a man, but, well, he is," Rob agreed. "He's almost a giant." Sapphire looked towards the door. Keeping close to her, the two children also looked and listened. There was no sound from outside in the hallway. Steel was still asleep in the chair. He had been like that when Rob and Helen had first run into the kitchen with their news. Sapphire had been in the office, but she came out quickly when they had called to her. Now, as they regained their breath, Rob and Helen waited for Sapphire to think of something. "In the front doorway, you say?" Sapphire was still looking towards the hallway door. "Yes," said Rob. "He appeared there." "No, he knocked on the door. Then Helen and I tried to open the door, but he pushed it back, broke the lock." "He came from outside?" Sapphire asked as she walked slowly towards the hallway door, Rob and Helen close at her heels. "Yes," said Rob. "Not from inside the house." Sapphire halted by the door, which was, as Rob and Helen had left it, just slightly ajar. "So he wasn't one of the soldiers?" "No," said Rob. "He was dressed in ordinary clothes. Anyway, he was bigger than the soldiers." "He's a giant, Sapphire," whispered Helen, moving close to her. Sapphire put her arm around Helen. All right, she said, calming the child. Sapphire glanced at Steel, who was still asleep. Then she angled her head to listen at the partly open door. There was no sound from the hallway. Withdrawing her head, Sapphire spoke quietly. "Did he enter the house?" Rob shrugged. "I don't know. We didn't wait to see." Sapphire nodded, then reached out carefully for the door handle. "Can't we wake Steel?" asked Rob quickly. "No." Sapphire began to ease the door gently open. "I'm afraid for the time being, it's just the three of us." She looked out into the hallway, and Rob and Helen peered out with her. The hallway was deserted. The front door was closed. Rob noticed this. He was about to whisper the fact to Sapphire when she nodded, having read his thought yet again. "Now, follow me, but be very quiet and do as I say." Sapphire whispered the instructions quietly. "Understand?" Rob and Helen both nodded. Sapphire led them both through the doorway and into the hall, one on either side of her, a hand on each of their shoulders. They moved like a small formation along the quiet hallway. Rob was beginning to think, even hope, that it was another trick, another illusion projected by whatever was in the room upstairs. The entrance door was closed, so maybe the lock was still intact. Perhaps the door had not really been forced open after all. Visual refractions, Sapphire had called the soldiers, before light had got into them. Well, perhaps the big man was the same, and visual refractions could not break real doors. They could make you think it. "Look!" said Helen as they reached the door. Rob looked. The door was closed, but the lock was still broken. Screws and pieces of splintered wood lay on the floor around the door. The bolts were still drawn back. Looking up at Sapphire, Rob wished that she would take them all back to the kitchen immediately. Once there, they could always barricade the door and wait for Steel to recover, maybe even force him to recover. But Sapphire was reaching out for the iron handle of the door. She jerked the door open and swung it back as far as it would go. There was no one in the doorway, and no one outside the door. "Hello, Sapphire!" The deep, resonant voice came from inside the house. Sapphire, Rob, and Helen all turned to look. The big man in the dark clothes was sitting on a step halfway up the first staircase. He seemed to cover the width of the stair. "Anything to eat in this place?" said the man. "I'm starving." "It's him," whispered Helen as she tugged at Sapphire's dress. "It's the giant!" Sapphire looked at the man for a moment, then turned and closed the door. "Yes, I suppose you could call him that," she said, quite calmly, as she pushed home the top bolt. "But his name's Lead." "Lead?" said Rob, bewildered. Sapphire nodded. "That's right, Lead." The man stretched his arms, flexed his shoulders, then eased his large frame into a standing position. "So where is he?" his voice boomed. "Where's Steel?" Steel's eyes opened slowly. He looked up. Lead's tall shape threw a long shadow over Steel and the chair and the area around the fireplace. "Lead?" Steel murmured, tilting his head back to look up. "Is that Lead? Here?" "Yes." The big man nodded patiently, almost warily. "I'm here." When Sapphire had taken Lead into the kitchen, Steel had been still asleep in the chair by the fire, but he had seemed more relaxed in sleep. His breathing was regular, and he no longer shuddered feverishly at the cold inside it. Sapphire had given Lead some food, and Rob and Helen had sat at the table and watched the man as he ate. Half a loaf of bread, held in his massive hand, looked like a sandwich at a village fete, Rob thought. But apart from his size, his obvious strength, and his world-weary smile, Lead was pleasant enough. In fact, compared to Steel, he was positively friendly. And Robert thought about the name Lead. It suited the man in the same physical way that made the names Sapphire and Steel seem so appropriate. Rob was reminded of the protective flashings and the lead-covered areas of roof on the old house, the dark, heavy, bluish metal that was like a kind of armour. Sapphire had explained what had happened in the house, and Lead had listened and nodded as he ate his meal. When Lead had asked if anyone in the house had been taken, Sapphire had glanced at Rob before telling Lead about the disappearance of Rob's parents. She had said it as tactfully as possible, but Rob had felt the cramped feeling of sadness inside him, like a quick, dull pain. The big man, Lead, seemed to have noticed. He had looked up from his food and gazed directly at Rob. "It's all right, son," the man had said, his deep voice rumbling out the words. "They'll get your parents back for you, somehow." And he had returned to his meal, and Sapphire had moved to the stove, picked up the scuttle, and shaken more fuel onto the hot coals. "I mean, you can guarantee it, can't you?" Lead was looking down at the blanket-covered Steel. "You can guarantee I'm here. Whenever you decide to wander off and ice yourself up without me around, you're in trouble." Rob looked at Sapphire and noticed that she smiled slightly at this. But the bantering seemed to work. It started a spark, began to bring Steel back to his old self. "I am not in trouble," Steel said, shaking the blanket from his shoulders. Lead seemed unimpressed. "All right, then." He ambled back towards the kitchen table. "You're not in trouble? You don't need help?" "No." "But you need insulation." Steel moved forward in the chair as Lead continued. "And that's me." He tapped his broad chest and sat himself down at the table once more, making Rob wonder if the man was ready to eat again now that a good half an hour had passed since the meal. "You tell him, Sapphire." Lead waved his hand as if to dismiss Steel, as if he had better things to do than pick up the pieces for others. "You tell him he shouldn't be doing that below-zero stuff without me around to protect him." Sapphire said nothing. She did not have to. Again it worked. Steel flung the blanket down and stood up from the chair. He turned to face the others. Rob felt better as he climbed into the makeshift bed in the sitting room. Helen had fallen asleep the moment she had snuggled under the blankets on the couch. Sapphire tucked the blankets in around her, then moved back to the door, opened it, and switched off the central light. "Are there many others?" asked Rob, sitting up in the bed. "Others?" Sapphire stood in the dark doorway of the room. "Others, like you, and steel and lead?" Sapphire considered the question for a moment or two. "About 127, she said eventually, and then gave the tease of a smile as she added, "Not counting the non-basic elements." Before Rob could ask another question, Sapphire put her finger to her lips. "Go to sleep now. We've a lot to do tomorrow." Sapphire then pulled the door to and left Rob to lie in the bed and think. And he felt more secure down here on the ground floor, with a small table lamp to counteract the dark, and knowing that Sapphire, Steel and Lead were all close at hand in the kitchen. And he felt more confident now. Steel had recovered, Sapphire was in her usual fine form, and Lead had arrived to help them. And he wondered how the thing in the attic room would be reacting at this moment, now that they were at full strength, with even a captive to bargain with if they wanted to bargain. Perhaps, under the circumstances, the thing would ask for its child back. Then Mum and Dad could be returned, and everything could be peaceful once more. Calmed by these thoughts, Rob fell asleep. He slept soundly. From behind the nailed-up door on the attic landing, there was a single flicker of light. Then there was darkness again for a long time, before the light pulsated once more from inside the room. It was like a signal. Down in the darkness of the cold office room, there was a similar glimmer of light. It came from inside the converted cabinet. A single dull flash that glowed and made patterns through the iced-up sheet of heavy glass. And, on the attic landing, the light behind the door replied in turn. The glow was then extinguished, as if whatever was behind the door had received an answer and was satisfied.